Hi, and welcome to the Davos in the Desert podcast series. These podcasts feature thought leaders in business and public policy and are meant to be informative and thought-provoking. Our guest is Professor Bryant Walker Smith. Professor Smith is an associate professor in the School of Law and the School of Engineering at the University of South Carolina, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. Without further ado, here is David Waintick, Davos in the Desert CEO and our podcast host.
So, Professor Smith, we have heard a lot about autonomous driving for probably a decade or more. And I know you focus on the legal issues that surround autonomous driving, but how much do we really need to worry about the legal issues if autonomous driving really isn't widespread, at least not now?
Mm-hmm. So this is something I've been saying, since 2011, that for over a decade, the prevailing wisdom seemed to be the vehicles are ready, the technology is ready. Why don't we have them? Oh, it must be because of the lawyers and the regulators and the law. And I have been saying ad nauseum, stop saying that. The technologies are not ready. They're not at a demonstrated level of socially acceptable risk. That's at least what I was saying until a couple of years ago. And then the whole mood, I think, kind of shifted. And a bunch of people started saying, oh, this is never going to work. We're never going to have these vehicles. This is all just a ruse. And I found myself saying, what are you talking about? They're not perfect. They're not ubiquitous, but automated driving is real in a way that it never has been before. And that is true today. We actually have automated vehicles on roads, vehicles that are not being supervised in real time by humans who are able to, in fractions of a second, intervene. And that is huge. That's the difference between climbing a mountain with a safety harness and free soloing without anything. And that speaks to a significant advance in both the technologies and the confidence of the companies behind those technologies, and means that a lot of the policy issues that otherwise could wait actually are becoming real. Now, as I've said for a while, that doesn't mean that law is the impediment. That certainly doesn't mean that ethics is the impediment. The technologies are happening. The companies, once they reach viable technical and financial cases, are going to deploy. And the question for the rest of us is, can we use our tools, including our legal and policy tools, to shape those deployments in ways that benefit society?
Mm-hmm. So I didn't tell you this, but I live in Chandler, Arizona, where Waymo is actually operating. So one can order a driverless taxi. It's a very limited area that you can go, but you can order and sit in a driverless taxi. Usually when a company introduces a new technology, they test it in a perfect environment. And so Chandler is pretty much a perfect environment for auto self-driving. Many of the streets are like a grid, very long streets and very clean streets because it's so hot. There's not very few children playing in the streets, very few dogs roaming the streets. Maybe about 70% of the people in Chandler live in a private community. So there's a lot of traffic outside of the main streets. People have big driveways so they don't park their cars on the streets. It's very flat. There's no snow. There's very little rain. So what I'm saying, it's a really perfect community, and it does seem to work here. But how scalable how scalable do you think autonomous driving is? Can it operate in very difficult environments?
I was smiling because I remember when states and cities were trying to recruit automated driving companies very publicly. And some of them would say, as you did, come here, it's utopia. Everything is perfect. Our streets are paved daily and there's no snow. And other communities were like, come here, it's dystopia. We have potholes everywhere. We have chaos. We have snow. And it was two very different arguments to try to recruit these companies. So you are describing the simple environments and until recently the slow speeds that along with some form of supervised operations really characterized these early pilots and even deployments. Now, in contrast to Chandler, Waymo is also deployed in San Francisco, which, again, there are caveats. It is not perfect, but that represents a much more complex environment. The challenge that you mentioned of scalability is a really interesting one to me, because there are at least two components. The one, well, really, yeah, the one is technological scalability. And that means if it works in Chandler, will it work in Phoenix? And if it works in Phoenix, will it work in Atlanta? And how quickly can a company go from one to the other? Is it completely retraining the system, or is it taking a lot of what they already know and doing some tweaks and confirmations? The next step of that is if it works in Phoenix, does it work in Minneapolis? And does it work in Minneapolis in the winter? And there, I think we have not seen any indication that companies are in the least bit confident about their performance in these kinds of wintry environments or otherwise much more challenging environments. Granted, San Francisco has a lot of on-the-ground complexity. It doesn't have a lot of snow. So that's the technological scalability. And it's, can you actually do an environment and how much extra effort does it take you to do that environment? Is it like the cable company coming up and hooking up an extra connection to your house, or is it like them running the wire 1,000 miles to reach you? The second is the economic scalability. And I think this has gotten a lot of misconceptions where people say, well, why aren't the companies expanding everywhere? And why aren't they in my neighborhood and all these other neighborhoods? And that must mean that something is holding them back. And what I wonder about even more than the technological feasibility or scalability is the economic scalability. So if we're talking about the taxi model, how does a company like Waymo compete with Uber? So Uber or Lyft have a network of individual drivers who, according to some studies, make less than minimum wage, maintain their own moderately priced cars themselves, and do a ton of just essentially subsidized labor so that I can get my cheap ride to the airport. In contrast, an automated driving company using the conventional model is going to need, well, a very nice vehicle with very nice hardware that it maintains very meticulously. It's going to need a remote monitoring center for people who are not necessarily driving, but are able to provide customer support, or able to interface with law enforcement, or able to step in and perhaps help a vehicle identify a path through a construction zone or a crash scene. And all of these people presumably will be making minimum wage at least. That human infrastructure is in addition to the vast data infrastructure, the maps, the software monitoring, the continuous software updates that are necessary for these systems. And so when I compare those two business models, it sure seems to me that the automated driving system, while automated driving, nonetheless potentially involves a lot more people, maybe earning a lot more than the very service that they're competing with. Now, I want to recognize that that's not the only business case for automated driving, but that's I think, a key challenge for the economic scalability of any of these systems.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. We can come back to that in a minute, but maybe talk to us about what's happening as far as autonomous trucks. I understand that there's big stretches in Texas that trucks drive 100, 200 miles on the freeway. Is that correct? And what do you see going on with trucks?
Mm-hmm. So trucking is another one of the potential use cases, and one that's waxed and waned in interest over the years. I should note that we can talk about others, local delivery, last mile delivery, including using smaller vehicles, various provision of various services, and the more traditional OEM automaker approach of introducing features on vehicles. And that's what Daimler is doing now with their level 3 feature, where people who can afford a nice car can afford the nice hardware and even the nice service to use it in certain conditions. And so each of these are potential applications of automated driving technologies. So trucking, long haul trucking, has been appealing because of the potential economic gain of not requiring a driver who needs breaks and doesn't necessarily want to be away from home for a long time to deliver a lot of goods. Once you're able to take labor costs, at least that part of the labor costs out, potentially you get a lot more flexibility as well in scheduling and timing and even speed of a vehicle. The trucking industry routinely speaks of a driver shortage. One of my pet peeves is that terminology. I think that reflects an imbalance in what companies are willing to pay and what drivers are willing to accept. Nonetheless, that's, I think, the prospect of either not having or being unwilling to pay truck drivers what they demand is another key driver of this desire for automation. So for many years, a variety of companies have been testing or demoing automated trucks on roads, sometimes often with the cooperation of state departments of transportation and police agencies. Often, though, there's again a lot of fine print. Right? The headline will read, "Truck drives autonomously for 5 miles." And then in the 7th paragraph of the story, you'll read that there was a pilot car and police escorts and a car right behind it that was able to stop the vehicle, and all of these caveats that undermine the idea of a system really facing real-time conditions on its own. More recently, several companies, I think Aurora most prominently, have both been doing more independent and extensive testing, and have been speaking of some pretty near-term timeframes for deploying trucks on particular stretches of road. And this gets us into the economic question, because it's one thing to design a system that is capable of operating on every road or every freeway even in the country. And by system, I mean hardware, software, and this human and digital infrastructure. It's a much simpler problem to say, what are the key trucking corridors from one terminal to the next that are going to be the most attractive to our shipping partners, and to start with those. And that's where Texas and its a huge role in freight has a particular advantage.
So at the moment, are there trucking companies like Aurora that are operating autonomously for significant mileage on highways?
Mm-hmm. So there are companies that are, I'm going to say, testing their vehicles on public roads with support systems in place. Now, there are a few caveats for this. First, we don't publicly know the full extent of those support systems. And that's because nothing compels companies to disclose that. In California, testing of heavy vehicles is prohibited by DMV rule. In Texas, there are no disclosure requirements specific to automated driving, by and large. And these companies are operating generally with the knowledge and after some discussion with the State Department of Transportation. But we don't actually know every instance of testing or deployment. We, to my knowledge, have some examples of companies doing live runs of freight but nothing that is, I think a long-term system of delivery at this point.
Okay. All right. And then back maybe to the passenger vehicles. You're talking about the labor that's needed behind the scenes to make them work. Is one of those professions somebody that will be able to remote control an autonomous vehicle that gets stuck or that loses its way? Is that part of it?
Yeah. Everyone is really touchy about all of this. So truckers are point out incorrectly that their job involves far more than just watching the road and braking, steering, and accelerating. That there's all kinds of other stuff, from monitoring loads to responding to breakdowns, that they do. On the other side, a lot of the automated driving companies are very touchy about the implication that they use remote driving. In fact, one of the first, and to my knowledge, only attack ad in a campaign was against the Florida senator who shepherded some automated driving legislation in that state many years ago. And the narrator referred to driverless remote controlled cars. And that was particularly scary. And these companies have taken pains to say, no, 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 we don't do remote driving. That is, there is nobody sitting behind a monitor actually steering, braking, and accelerating. And they distinguish, therefore, automated driving from remote driving, another set of technologies, applications, and business cases that does actually involve people sitting hundreds of miles away, performing part of the real-time driving task. Now, that protest is one that deserves a lot of scrutiny. That companies are relying on remote assistance to do things that are pretty closely related to real-time driving. Identifying uncertain objects or situations when an automated vehicle is unclear, sketching routes, engaging with law enforcement, giving directions to a vehicle that then executes those directions on its own. And some recent publicly disclosed incidents have shed light on how that interplay works or doesn't. The very notorious Cruise crash, for example, where an automated vehicle moved when there was somebody underneath, or a more recent Waymo incident where a remote assistant provided an instruction to a vehicle regarding a traffic signal, and that resulted in a collision with a bicyclist. So there's a lot of gray zone that needs to be explored more. And some companies have, in fact, acknowledged that there could be instances when they would need to rely on true remote driving to, for example, move a vehicle that police had directed be moved under an emergency situation.
Okay. Do you think, though, the taxi drivers and Uber and Lyft drivers and their sympathizers will be able to foment significant opposition against autonomous driving?
There was a long time where this kind of elitist view prevailed that automation was coming for the blue collar jobs or the manual labor jobs, long before it was coming for the white collar or quote unquote skilled professions. And the public rise of generative AI, at least, I think, has really undermined that. At the point that automated driving is widespread, I think society will be reckoning with all kinds of other changes to all kinds of other professions wrought by automation writ large. And so the taxi drivers won't be alone. Having said that, it doesn't take 100% adoption to create significant changes and disruptions. And we saw that with Uber and Lyft, and I expect we'll see this with automated driving. Driving is also something that is so visceral to people. Everybody interacts with if they don't use motor vehicles every day. Everybody has an opinion on traffic. It's so concrete, it's so much a part of our culture that I think automated driving could become a larger symbol for these broader changes. So your job might be disrupted by some algorithm that negates the need for video editing, but it will be the AV you see going down the street that generates ire. Conversely, it may be where we put all our hope. Right? The ability to visit grandkids or get to appointments, have freedoms that we otherwise might not have. The automated vehicle could really epitomize that. So what I mean is that we're going to have broad changes to reckon with on timelines that are comparable for a lot of these domains. But I could see automated driving taking on a special symbolic importance in a lot of those debates and societal changes.
So does that mean that significant opposition can delay the adoption of autonomous driving, or not really?
So I would not read too much into incidents in, for example, San Francisco with people disrupting vehicles. People also disrupt storefront windows all the time, unfortunately. And your community in Chandler is an example of the technologies being fairly well accepted without that kind of opposition. We're going to see friction points. That is, in some states, there have already been efforts, successful or not, to restrict certain forms of automated driving, to require human drivers, to slow support in a way that was driven in part by job concerns. But I think, as with so many technologies, at the point that there is an economic case for companies and for the public, we're going to see a lot of the country accept the technologies surprisingly quickly. And again, we don't need 100%. If there's a community somewhere I'm not going to name names, if there's a community somewhere in the US that rejects automated driving, if there's a state that rejects automated driving, so what? That is not an impediment to its deployment more generally.
Mm-hmm. Or the companies like Uber and Lyft, they could offer two-tier pricing. Pay less if you take an autonomous ride, pay more if you have a human driver. That'd be one thing. And another thing would be if a customer takes the same route every day to go to work and come back, they may feel like the car and the system has learned that route, and that route is pretty safe. So that that may spur more autonomous driving. Another thing I'll say, and I'm saying this, is not Professor Smith saying this, is I'm not going to be popular among some communities, but some of the most successful people in the Chandler area are the lawyers that sue for auto accidents. So if it can be demonstrated that autonomous vehicles results in fewer auto accidents, there could be some opposition from accident attorneys. But anyway, go ahead.
That would be a good problem to have. So much of the experience of people in automated driving is that, first of all, we don't recognize the dangers of the status quo. Right? Have you ever gotten into an Uber and said, "So, can you show me your license? Can I look up your violation of speeding tickets? How much sleep did you get last night? And the night before that, how many hours have you been driving? Can I use this breathalyzer on you?" We don't do that. And people put their kids in these vehicles, realizing that today in the United States, 100 people are going to die on the roads. That's 100 people. They're not going to die because of automated vehicles. They're going to die because of the status quo. It is tragic and it is outrageous. And so people don't recognize that. And the shiny and the sexy is always new and scary. Generally, though, people without any exposure to these systems say, oh, that's scary, I would never do it. Then they do it, and it quickly becomes really boring. And in fact, in driver assistance systems, not automated driving, studies have shown just how quickly people acclimate, and they start assuming that the systems can do that far more than they can. But so most people are going to get pretty bored pretty fast. Now, when there's something weird that happens, that will again disrupt some people's confidence, and we'll go through, kind of a wave. But generally, people get bored with things pretty fast. Think about, what was it, 15 years ago, the controversy over Gmail collecting information, or cameras, or cell phones that had cameras on them. That was creepy. And now everybody has those. So I think we often reverse this problem. We say, oh no, there are all these issues that are going to prevent adoption, consumer trust, or ethics, or public policy goals. And in fact, it's the opposite, that the technologies, once they are promoted and once they find a use case that resonates with the public, are going to be adopted long before we can clarify their relationship to these broader societal values or goals.
Okay. All right, so we'll talk about accidents that happen, but are there other issues that we should be aware of or cautious of or concerned about relative to autonomous driving besides the crashes?
Well, and I want to clarify, we should be concerned about automated driving. We should be terrified about conventional driving. And so many of the issues that we ascribe to automated driving are ones that exist today. The safety of automated driving is not synonymous with the safety of our transportation system. Privacy issues are not unique to automated driving. Increasingly, enforcement issues, the ability of vehicles with sensors and computing power to measure what's happening inside a vehicle, even to record and analyze what's happening outside of a vehicle, and the power that gives to companies and to law enforcement, if those companies are compliant, voluntarily or otherwise, is an issue that will be, I think, highlighted by automated driving, but is by no means unique to automated driving. So what automated driving might do is highlight some of these broader issues that in society perhaps we should be talking about, but we're not. More generally, so crashes are an interesting case because automated driving isn't going to be super dangerous, at least not relative to our status quo. There will be failures, and companies will learn from those failures and will update their systems so that, generally speaking, they don't happen again. It's that monitoring and that opportunity for updates, or even shutting down a system, that draws a sharp contrast with our very decentralized system of motor vehicle transport today. Now, there are some caveats to that. The uncertain risks, the long tails or black swans, right? If a city were to be reliant on automated vehicles and suddenly it needed to be evacuated for a hurricane, and the systems were incapable of doing that, or they were offline because of a cyber attack, that is a systemic risk that might be different than our distributed system of risk today. If we find out that automated driving is making us all lazier because we're not even walking from the parking lot into the store, that is a systemic health risk. If, and I offer this as a hypothetical with absolutely no factual basis, right? We were all to discover that the combination of millions of LiDAR beams bumping off our eyes was somehow damaging us, right? That would be a systemic latent risk that might be discovered late. And I offer that as an example of the reality that the story of technology or policy or progress is taking one set of problems, replacing them with a new set of problems, and just really, really hoping that our new set of problems in aggregate is less than our old. And that's true of pretty much everything. Horses to cars, as probably my most colorful example.
Mm-hmm. Well, there could be a systemic risk if there's a cyber attack,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if somebody penetrates Uber's, algorithm and, causes harm, that could be a big problem. Another problem that, people might be concerned about on the social axis is, an autonomous driving service provider could program their algorithm that they won't serve certain communities. It may not serve a certain community after dark because there's crime and a risk to the vehicle, risk to the passengers, and but that could be systemically programmed into the system. So, and any comments about those issues?
Yeah, so we both mentioned cyber attacks as something that is not unique to automated driving. Most modern cars are connected, and an easy way to bring chaos to the streets, if there were a backdoor for this, would be to suddenly turn up the volume on every stereo to 140 decibels. That would be catastrophic. That doesn't require commandeering the steering. And so automated driving is not synonymous with vehicle connectivity. And vehicle connectivity is an issue today. But certainly, as with any infrastructure and any instance of centralization, yeah, we are putting a lot of eggs in one basket for any form of critical infrastructure. And I would include our transportation system in that. What was your second example?
The service providers' software can
Yes.
be programmed not to offer services in certain neighborhoods.
Yeah. So this is a good example of the centralization that I was describing. Right now, first of all, taxis won't be the only form in which automated driving is deployed. Again, wealthy people are likely to be able to afford some driving automation features earlier, so that their commutes along 101 in San Francisco or between New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York City are easier and less stressful. And then those technologies will roll out to others as the price comes down. But if we take taxis as a key example, right now we have a distributed system where for decades there have been complaints about taxi drivers profiling potential passengers or refusing pickups in certain neighborhoods or deliveries in certain drop-offs in certain neighborhoods. This is a decentralized problem of bias. And what you're describing is the possibility for a centralized system of targeted discrimination. And that's a mixed bag. On one hand, the effects of any one decision could be far more pervasive. On the other hand, to the extent that this can be checked and controlled, potentially it can be addressed far more effectively than we can with today's distributed system. And a company that took a deliberate decision to program its systems in that way would be leaving behind some kind of digital trail. And that could be very incriminating were it to be discovered. Now, as we move to more non-deterministic systems that are less auditable, I think that becomes an interesting question, whether companies are even aware of the kind of decisions or patterns that systems might undertake or recognize.
Okay. All right. So let's say there is a accident involving an autonomous vehicle. Who pays if the autonomous vehicle caused the accident? Is it the manufacturer, or they have their own insurance, or the writer of the code?
Yeah. So liability as a legal term has lots of meanings. It's first of all, it's narrower than responsibility. We can talk about legal responsibility or moral responsibility or technical responsibility, and these are not necessarily coterminous. But if we talk about legal responsibility and then the retrospective or backward-looking question of liability, that can be criminal. who goes to jail. It can be administrative, who gets the speeding ticket. And it can be, as I think you're describing, civil. That is, who do you sue and who pays? There is always more than one cause of any incident, of any crash or injury. And as we've seen in automotive litigation for years, that means that multiple people can be sued and multiple actors can be found liable. Maybe a driver was speeding, but their automatic braking system didn't work, and the airbag deployed in a way that was dangerous, and so on and so on. And so when we're talking about harm, if an automated vehicle, did something that a human would not have done, then we can expect the manufacturer or deployer of that system to be liable. And multiple automated driving or automotive companies have in effect said, yeah, we accept that responsibility for when our vehicles are at fault. That's tautological insofar as they accept liability when they're liable. But that isn't anything, nonetheless, an important statement. Likewise, under existing rules of products liability, if a automated vehicle fails to prevent a crash that another automated vehicle would have prevented, then potentially there's liability in that situation too, even if a human would not have prevented that. So to give you an example, imagine we have a T intersection and we have a human driver coming to a stop sign. They blow through the stop sign and strike another driver who does not have a stop sign. Ordinarily, we'd say, oh, well, yeah, the driver who failed to stop, they are liable. But in the future, if this other vehicle is an automated vehicle that has sensors and systems capable of recognizing that the incoming vehicle is not decelerating and is on a crash course with the automated vehicle, and that crash occurs, then we can expect to say, well, yes, the other driver should be liable for running the stop sign, but does the manufacturer of the automated driving system also have some liability because their system could and should have recognized that there was a crash and taken measures to avoid that, at least insofar as we're talking about the injuries to the occupant of that automated vehicle. This is the reality of new technologies. Airbags save countless lives. Every now and then, an airbag, through a malfunction or just through a feature of its design, injures somebody. And we still say manufacturers are liable because the system could have been designed in an even safer way to prevent that harm. Now, so that means that a lot of this financial risk is going to shift to the manufacturers, the companies that, in my view, are actually driving these vehicles through their human and machine agents. That means, in turn, that a lot of that will be managed through commercial liability insurance. What role does that leave for the consumer-facing automotive insurers? Well, they don't want to be cut out of everything. So I expect that in the event of a crash, they will be more than happy to facilitate a claim and to compensate their insured before then turning to the companies behind the scene and saying, let's figure this out.
Okay. So
I will say no one should be hit by a vehicle, and I would not wish that upon anybody. But if it's a choice between being hit by a vehicle driven by a underinsured driver with basically the car title, if that, to their name, and being hit by one that is being effectively driven by a multi-million or billion-dollar company, I think that they're better off being hit by the latter.
So as autonomous driving becomes more common, do you think insurance premiums will fall, at least for the autonomous vehicles, if not for the general public?
So if we're talking about insuring an automated vehicle, that presumes that there's an individual ownership model. If we're talking about the kind of consumer-facing automotive insurance that most people are going to be familiar with. And a lot of that insurance is reflective of other things that happen to cars. Trees fall on them, hail falls on them, expensive sensors get bashed in. And those kinds of claims actually could be more expensive as the sophistication of a vehicle increases. That's at least one possibility, that every time you get a little bump in your car, you have to take it into a qualified technician who has lots of extra training and equipment to perfectly calibrate all of the sensors before it can go out again. The other possibility, another extreme, is that we have self-calibrating technologies that are so good that you just get shipped another little sensor in the mail, you plop it on the vehicle, and it's good. I'm hyperbolizing a little bit, but that's the extreme. And so insurers have actually been hit by recently the expense of all of the sensors and equipment on advanced vehicles that aren't automated vehicles. And so I think they will be extra cautious with their risk profiles there. In the future, to the extent that automated driving is substantially safer than our legacy technologies, whether it's a vehicle today or the average 11-plus-year-old vehicle on the roads today, I would expect that human driving could become more expensive, given the substantial risks that might entail relative to automated driving if the technologies are sufficiently demonstrated.
Mm-hmm. If one does get into an accident with an autonomous vehicle that's operated by a big service company like Uber or Lyft, or owned by a big auto manufacturer, that entity, if they're solely at fault, should make good on the claim against them or their insurance company, rather than putting the victim at the forcing them to go through a grueling exercise of maybe litigating against the sensor company, the LiDAR company, the software company that may have contributed to the malfunction in the autonomous vehicle. Is that the way you see it?
Well, that's certainly my normative view, that companies are driving these vehicles. They're acting through their human and machine agents. And so the key question is whether the companies are worthy of our trust. And a trustworthy company shares its safety philosophy, makes a promise to the public, and keeps that promise. And part of that key promise is being candid about its limitations and failures and making things right when it fails. And that includes mitigating harms promptly, fully, and publicly. That is, I think, important to the argument of trust us that a lot of these companies are making implicitly or even explicitly, that when things fail, they will step up. Now, will that manifest in the individual case? There have been a lot of concerns at the federal level that forced arbitration agreements will reduce the opportunities that people have for seeking recourse. In fact, one of the reasons why there has been no federal legislation on automated driving is this dispute about a provision that would prohibit forced arbitration agreements. You and I are already in contract, I suspect, with companies as diverse as Uber, Lyft, Alphabet, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, the list goes on. And under US law, that means that those companies are often able to specify the means, the venue, the place, the law under which issues will be resolved, including by directing it to individual arbitration. So, like everything, the legal system kind of muddies through and never reaching the best outcome or the best structure, but always kind of falling back on second best solutions. So is this perfect? No. Will it work generally? Yeah, well, kind of work generally.
Okay. And for an auto company to do its testing or to offer services, do they have to get regulatory approval from the relevant city, county, state, federal government, or how does that work?
So, depending on the jurisdiction, they don't have to do anything. They're at at the federal level, a lot of that depends on the particular vehicle design and a company's, and for that matter, the current administration's interpretation of existing federal safety standards. So if you have a vehicle that already meets standards for design and you just automate it, well, that's probably compliant with federal law and nothing more needs to happen. Once you start taking out the steering wheel and the pedals and the mirrors, things might get a little more complicated federally, but we've seen you don't have to do that to have a pretty substantial fleet. Then at the state level, there is a wide spectrum. California has the most robust prospective regulatory regime. That is, a company that wants to test needs to get permission from the state to deploy. It needs to actually get permission from two entities, at least if it's providing ride services, and that comes with specific reporting requirements and other processes. A lot of people said when that was passed that no one would ever test or deploy in California. And the opposite's actually been true. A bunch of companies have come over and gotten their little permission letter and gone back to investors and others and said, look, we're credible. We have government approval. Other states, Florida passed a law years ago that more or less said automated driving has always been legal. It's still legal. Do a couple safety things and you're good. Arizona has legislation now, but for many years had no law specific to automated driving and was home to some of the most advanced automated driving activities in the world. And so in many of the states, there is no prospective approval that is required for testing or deployment. And even if the deployment is a taxi model or so-called ride sharing or TNC model, even then, a number of states have preempted localities in the regulation of that. And it's not clear that there's any special approval that a company would need specific to their automated driving service to provide that. So the claim that regulation is stopping technology is a tired excuse. And the best evidence for that is if law were the only obstacle, then we would see automated driving somewhere in the country and somewhere in the world from that particular entity.
Mm-hmm. And just last, a couple quick questions. As far as the frame of the car that facilitates autonomous driving, does it matter if it's an EV, an electric vehicle versus a combustion engine? And then what happens to the weight of the car if a car is made autonomous? Does it become lighter because maybe you don't need a driver's seat and some other things, or does it become heavier because you have more sensors and technology?
Mm-hmm. So let's see. Power and weight. So most of the automated vehicles that are being developed and tested, at least from the passenger side, are electric. And there are some advantages to that. It's also a fairly big draw on the battery, at least in some of the test systems. But there's no reason why a vehicle needs to be electric. The automated system is in effect a driver, taking in inputs, making decisions, and specifying outputs. And that can be on a internal combustion vehicle, battery electric, hybrid, hydrogen, provided it's calibrated to recognize the limitations of that system. For reputational reasons and business reasons and possibly economic reasons, I think we'll see a lot of pairing of battery or at least hybrid technologies with automated driving. With respect to weight, that's a near-term and long-term question. So near term, there's no real gain for automating a conventional vehicle frame and design. In fact, for reasons of regulatory anachronicity, is that a noun? Let's go with it. You might even have a rear view mirror and a steering wheel and side mirrors. Removing the side mirrors could reduce emissions, but it could reduce drag, but isn't going to substantially reduce weight. And the battery demands of these systems are not small. Long term, there is a hope that vehicles that are far less likely to crash might not need the kind of occupant protection that our vehicles have now. But that is a long way away as a matter of design and as a matter of demonstration and regulation. And there are a lot of assumptions that are baked into that. I appreciate that you note vehicle weights, because we are seeing a dramatic uptick in pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities in particular. And there are lots of possible explanations for that in the US, which is an outlier in so many ways that are not good on this topic. But vehicle size and vehicle weight is likely part of this story.
Mm-hmm. And it also taxes the infrastructure, everything from bridges to parking lots, elevated parking lots. And I think some of the safety barriers on highways are not strong enough to repel an EV that strikes it. So that's a concern.
A lot of our design assumptions do not reflect current vehicles. Oops.
Right, right. Well, I think I've exhausted pretty much all of my questions. So, Professor Smith, we're very pleased that you were able to spend some time with us and educate us a lot on the legal issues that arise with autonomous driving. So, thank you.
Thanks so much for your outstanding questions.